Good evening, class. I'd like to take a little time today just to go over the hodograph. It's what we're going to be learning this evening. And I figured there'd be no better way to do it than just to go over the quiz. Quiz 9 is what we will be addressing this evening. And how to work the problems. And just looking ahead a little bit too, the third quarter exam will be your last exam that you will have, the last quarter exam that you will have in this course. We're beginning to wrap up the semester pretty quickly here, and I don't want to overload you heading into the final because there will be a lot of material on the final. And don't worry though, we're going to make it very doable, and I don't want to overload you. I want to have time for the Hodograph stuff to sink in, and we're going to run through a bunch of severe weather forecasting exercises in the coming weeks. So I don't want that stuff to overrun you and you not be able to keep up. So here's the deal for quiz 9. Basically, we're just going to be looking at hodographs, and I'm going to be showing you how to plot various kinematic or wind parameters. Okay. So for question 1, what is the ground relative wind speed at 2,000 meters? Basically, a little background on the hodograph. The hodograph is in polar coordinates. So here's your x-axis right here. Here's your y-axis. I've just cut out a quarter of the hodograph. The whole thing normally looks like, well, I don't have it pulled up right now, but this is just 1/4. You know, this would be, let's see, thinking back on mathematics, I think this is the 4th quadrant. I can't remember, but anyway, so this is all you need to know, is that you, on a hodograph, you have an x-axis and a y-axis, and your wind speed is 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. It's along these radials, and 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 again, all the way out to however far it is in knots, 80 on the x-axis and 60, a little over 60 on the y right here. But you can see way out here, this would be 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. So you can barely see the edge of the 100-knot radial, if you'll see way out there. This is the 50-knot radial. There's the 60-knot radial, etc. And so it's in polar coordinates. So in order to plot something, you're going to need both a speed and a direction. The speed will be in knots, always in knots for plotting the hodograph. And the direction is in degrees the wind is blowing toward. Okay, so a wind from the west is going to be 270 here, but a wind from the south in this case is going to be 180. And see how that works? And a wind blowing toward the north, or a wind at 225 would be right here. So you plot it, the direction the wind is blowing toward. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example. This asks for the ground relative wind. That's just, there's ground relative and storm relative wind frameworks in environmental or atmospheric science, meteorology. So the ground relative wind speed is just your traditional meteorological wind speed, wind direction. Okay, there's storm relative wind, speed and direction, and ground relative wind, speed and direction. And what we're going over first is ground relative wind, and I just want you to think of that just like you do any old given day in meteorology. So we have a south wind. Okay, we're not going to be factoring the storm motion component yet, which is down here. I'll teach you how to do that in a moment. So I'm going to give you an example. That'd probably be the best way to do it. The ground relative wind speed and direction at 1 kilometer. So you can see that there's our origin, x-axis, y-axis. So all you do is you go up 190 degrees to where this line intersects from the origin, intersects 1 kilometer, which is right here. I've got these this hodograph trace, which is the red line. That's what we call the hodograph trace. I've got it marked in red. Okay, and you build everything else off the hodograph trace. So everything else is built off of this. Okay, so the 2,000 meter, 2 kilometer ground relative wind direction is 190 degrees from the origin. You'll just trace up to where a black line intersects 1 kilometer, which is 190 degrees. Okay, I'll give you another example. Let's find the ground relative wind of 9 kilometers, or 9,000 meters. Right here, we'll go back to the origin and we'll trace up. And it looks like it's directly midway between the 250 and the 260 degrees markers. So it's 255 degrees is the ground relative wind direction. And going back to our example from the first one I gave you, 1 kilometer, 190 degrees, the wind direction at 1 kilometer on the hodograph. Okay, and it's 40 knots. That's the speed. That's how you do that. And then we said that our direction, our ground relative wind direction at 9,000 meters, 9 kilometers, was 255 degrees. Well, what's the speed? It looks like it's midway between 60 and 70, so 65 knots. Okay, so that's how you find the ground relative stuff. And obviously, there's the 2,000 meter mark on the hodograph. The hodograph is ascending with height. So there's the surface, 500, 1 kilometer, 1524 meters, 2,000 meters, 3,000, 4572 meters, etc. Okay? At each one of these little red dots is another point where, as the radio sonde ascended through the atmosphere, the Ray-1 sonde, it was taking observations at those points. And it was taking more observations typically than that, but those are just the ones that we're going to use for this exercise. Okay, those are just the ones that I plotted. And a VAD wind profiler, a VWP, can also be used to construct a hodograph. Those are found on the NEXRAD units across the United States. Okay, for question 2, what is the storm relative wind speed and direction at 3,000 meters? Okay, so for this, these are these colored lines, all except for the pink one. The pink line is storm motion. So that's the storm motion coordinate right there in polar coordinates on the hodograph. And we'll go over that more in a moment. But the ground relative wind vectors, or excuse me, the storm relative wind vectors are these color lines right here. The orange, the blue, green, yellow, purple, and these 2 zigzag lines right here. Okay, those are your storm relative wind vectors. The orange one is known as a storm relative inflow vector, and they can be different colors on different hodographs. It doesn't have, this is just the color coding scheme I chose. The only highlighters I had lying around that I could find. So after you construct your hodograph, one of the things you'll want to do is plot your storm motion dot, which is this right here, this black dot where everything comes together. All these lines are coming together here. And then from there, to find the storm relative wind, once you have your hodograph trace and your storm motion dot, all you do is project back to the hodograph at the level you want to find the storm relative wind for. From the storm motion dot, go back to the hodograph. See how these arrows are pointing back to the hodograph? And connect them. For instance, this is the 1 kilometer storm relative wind vector. 500 meters, blue. Surface storm relative inflow, aka storm relative wind at the surface, vector in orange. From the storm motion dot to any point on the hodograph to find the storm relative wind, okay? At any level you want. So this asks for it at 3,000 meters. That would obviously be this one, the purple. But I'm not going to use that to help you see how to do this. So we're going to look again at the blue. And measuring the length of that, if you stick your pencil up there and mark the place on your hand where it touches, or use a ruler and measure it, and then you translate it back down to either the X or the Y axes and see how long that is. I'm getting about 45 knots for that particular 500 meter storm relative wind vector. Okay, so that's how to find the storm relative wind. So now you can kind of see that storm relative wind is dictated by the storm motion. This dot right here, where it is plotted on the hodograph, will determine how long these storm relative wind vectors are. Okay? And you can see how the storm relative winds in the lower levels, from like 3,000 meters on down to the surface, right here, surface, are much stronger than the storm relative winds higher in the atmosphere at 5791 meters and at 9,000 meters. And again, you can plot more storm relative wind vectors if you want. You could do one at 7315, just connecting a dot between the storm motion dot right here and the place on the hodograph at 7315. That would be your storm relative wind vector at 7315 meters. Okay? So we will move on, and we'll discuss more why storm relative wind is important. It's important for determining storm relative felicity. And the storm relative felicity, guys, all that is it's the area bound by three things, three items. Your hodograph trace, the level at the storm relative wind vector at the level that you'd like to find storm relative felicity for. We'll do it for 2,000 meters, 0 through 2,000 meters storm relative felicity. You'd come back down to the storm motion, then back down the storm relative inflow vector at the surface. So let's say you want to find it. This box shape, or this area right here, is 0 through 2,000 meters storm relative felicity, the area found within that shape. Okay? And I'm going to give you a mathematical formula next that'll help you calculate that. All right, if you were to find 0 through 3,000 meter, I'll just go down to the actual problem. Well, it's in a few moments. So say we were to find 0 through 1 kilometer storm relative felicity. You have your storm motion dot. Just go down the storm relative inflow vector to the hodograph trace, around, then back down the 0 through 1 kilometer, 0 through 1,000 meters storm relative wind vector back to the storm motion dot. So that the area contained within this pie-shaped piece right here is your 0 through 1,000 meter storm relative felicity. The area contained within that shape, right in through there, that pie-shaped piece, okay? So, and another thing, that on the direction for the storm relative winds, that will actually be, you will find that, this is going to be confusing, I know, but you will find that as traditional meteorological coordinates. So the direction that the storm relative wind vector is coming out of here at 500 meters, it's out, excuse me, it's out of the east-southeast, right? So if you look at this, you can see traditional meteorological, like if you were going to report the wind vector right here during one of your broadcasts, you would say this wind is out of the east-southeast. Same thing with storm relative wind. So this storm relative wind vector would be out of the east-southeast at, we found it to be 45 knots. Remember, if you'll trace this length down here to the x-axis, it translates out to 45 knots in length. Okay? If you just translate that down. Alrighty? So let's go down to, what is the 0 through 5791 meter bulk shear? Okay, just in knots. You can see here's your answer options down here. So 0 through 5791. Here's the surface. These dashed lines are your bulk shear vectors. Okay, so there's the 0 through 5791 bulk shear vector. This would be this 0 through 9,000 meter, 9 kilometer bulk shear vector right here. Okay, so all you'll do is just like you did with storm relative and ground relative winds. You'll take the you'll take the bulk shear vector you need and translate it down to the surface, or down to the x-axis or y-axis, depending on which one you prefer. So just measure that with a ruler. See how many knots that it lines out to be. It translates to be down here. All right, and that'll give you the answer for that. Bulk shear, guys, is good for determining storm development, as I think we've covered somewhat in this class before. In speed, it can help you determine the type of thunderstorm that's possibly capable of developing. And there's some variance there. But also the angle of the bulk shear vector to the front or to the storm initiating dry line or prefrontal trough can tell you a little bit about what type of thunderstorm to expect. The storm mode, will it be a supercell, a multicell, a squall line, aka MCS? You know, what will happen? So we'll talk more about that in a moment. Okay, so what is the storm motion? We briefly touched on this a moment ago. Here's the storm motion dot. The pink line from the origin here illustrates the direction of storm motion, and just kind of helps guide you to the storm motion dot, which is here. But you'll find the storm motion just using the polar coordinates of the speed and the degrees. Okay, that's all you'll do here. Same way you found wind speed at 1 kilometer. We found it to be 190 degrees at 40 knots. Okay, so you'll do the same thing here for this dot. That's the storm motion dot. Okay, what is the critical angle? So back in 2008, fellas with the last name of Esterheld and Giuliano did some groundbreaking research looking at some supercell thunderstorms that have produced strong and violent tornadoes, and also some non-tornadic cases, a wide array of cases, trying to determine if this critical angle, quote unquote, could help tornadoes develop, if it was responsible for allowing strong to violent tornadoes to occur in the environment. And the way you find this is by looking, so here's your hodograph trace, as we had mentioned, the red solid red line here. You find your storm motion dot, trace down the storm relative inflow vector to the surface, and then back up to 500 meters on the hodograph. So your 0 through 500 meter bulk shear, which is this, right? The angle that forms with your storm relative inflow vector. That is critical angle. So just find the angle that is swept out right in through here between the red line from 0 through 1 kilometer, surface to 500 meters, which is here. Okay. What angle does this red line take to the orange line, which is the storm relative inflow vector? And that'll give you critical angle. Please calculate storm Relativefelicity within the 0 through 1 kilometer, 0 through 1,000 meter layer. That's just to right here. Remember we mentioned it was this pie shape bound by the lines. It's the shape that is bound by the storm relative inflow vector in orange, the hodograph trace, red line, to 1 kilometers, then back down the 1 kilometer storm relative wind vector to the storm motion. So we're going to use this little equation to find that. So you're going to need to find the mean wind in knots and multiply that by the mean wind in direction, a mean wind direction in degrees. And you're probably asking me already, how do I do that? It's pretty simple. You'll just take your storm motion that you found, your storm motion vector, right there, your motion dot, and you'll divide that by 0.75, okay? So basically the mean wind, the storm motion, is 75% of the mean wind. All right, that's some research that was found by Robert Maddox back in 1976. Robert Maddox was working for the National Severe Storms Lab and did some research on supercell thunderstorms in general, and found that storm motion is often 75% of the mean wind. So this is a very important, this is the first step you're probably going to want to do, is right here, this step. Take the storm motion dot, take that vector, that speed in knots, and divide it by 0.75. That's going to be the trick there to success. And that will give you the mean wind. Keep the same direction for now. We're not going to go into all that. Some people say that supercell storm motion deviates by 20 to 30% to the right of the mean wind, and that's true in many cases, but it's not true for all cases. There's some supercells we're learning that appeared to not deviate to the right of the mean wind. And excuse me, and that's actually some research I'm doing here at Mississippi State. But so that's how you find the mean wind. Once you find the mean wind, you're going to want to multiply the mean wind speed in knots by the mean wind direction in degrees. Okay? So remember your degrees, matter of fact, I'll just go ahead and give that to you. Okay? Your mean wind's direction, you know what, I better not because it was one of the questions up here. Okay. So I'm actually going to wait on that, but find it just like we've talked about finding the wind speed at 1 kilometer. Okay? Or at 9,000 meters, 9 kilometers. Okay? And once you have that value that you found results from multiplying, let me get back on track. Okay. So once you've multiplied your mean wind speed in knots by your mean wind direction in degrees, you're going to add that to the ground relative layer wind speed change in knots in the layer you want to find storm relativefelicity for by the ground relative layer wind direction change in degrees. In other words, if we were wanting to find it for 0 through 2 kilometers, you'd want to get the direction and speed of the wind at 2,000 meters, 2 kilometers, and then get it, the wind speed and direction in degrees at the surface, okay? And then you'd want to take the difference. You'd want to subtract the lesser number from the bigger number and get the number of change in degrees and in knots in that layer, and then you'll want to add or multiply those two together. Ground relative layer wind speed change in knots by ground relative layer wind direction change in degrees. Okay? And once you get that value, that's one quantity, all of that, you'll multiply it times 12.5. Okay? And once you've added the whole, everything that's in parentheses here, you'll want to multiply it times 0.0093. Okay? I should probably actually have another set of parentheses, one here and a parentheses there. So this entire thing is processed together as one. Okay? And then you'll multiply it. The parentheses, though, would stop here. From here to here, there should be another set of parentheses there. And then you'd multiply the result of that whole piece that's in parentheses times 0.0093. And that'll give you a very good storm relativefelicity estimate. This is not the formal academic way of doing this, I'll be honest, but it is a highly effective way of doing it, unless you have an area where the wind veers, backs, and veers in a very short little layer. For instance, if this little layer right here would help weaken a storm relativefelicity estimate using this equation within the 0 through 3 kilometer layer. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to find it within the 0 through 1 kilometer layer, which is what we're tracing out here. Okay? And so try that out. Let me know if you have questions. That's probably the most difficult thing you'll do on your Quiz 9. Just keep me informed if you need help. But if you'll just follow everything step by step, what we just did, you'll probably have no trouble calculating storm relativefelicity. Okay? Question 7. Please calculate the energy helicity index. For this case, assuming that the CAPE is 2,000 joules per kilogram. Also make certain to use the storm relativefelicity in the 0 through 1 kilometer layer that we found in this problem right here. Okay? So that's how to do this. Question 7. Now question 8. What is the angle between the storm initiating boundary and the 0 through 5791 meter bulk shear vector? This one right here. The dashed black lines. And the reason I'm asking this question is not only is it a good exercise, but there's some research that was done, I believe by Howard Bluestein from the Oklahoma State University, the University of Oklahoma years ago. And it was further confirmed by a paper by Dial and Racy from the Storm Prediction Center, I believe back in, I think it's 2004. Correct me if the year's wrong, but I know it's by Dial and Racy from the Storm Prediction Center. Storm initiating boundaries to upper level kinematics, the orientation between the two. And so the reason why I would like for you to calculate the angle between the 0 through 1 kilometer layer wind, that would be right in through here, and the 5791 storm bulk shear vector, this one, bulk shear vector, 0 through 5791 meters, is because that will help tell you what type of storm is going to form. Supercell, multicell, squall line, especially differentiating between QLCS squall line and supercells. So if the angle is greater than 45 degrees, typically you're going to have supercells. Unless the storm relativefelicity is really high, then you can have embedded supercells if the angle is less than 45 degrees between the storm initiating boundary and the mid-level storm relative or mid-level bulk shear, okay, which would be this one. So how do you find the orientation of the storm initiating boundary? I'm sure you're probably asking that. That's going to be by finding typically the orientation of your 1 kilometer ground relative wind vector. So you're just going to find the origin, which is here, mathematical origin, and trace up till you connect with 1 kilometer, which is right here. So your storm initiating boundary is going to be assumed to be oriented at 190 degrees, about like that. Okay, so on the hodograph then, since we've assumed a 190 degree angle on the hodograph, let's look at the 5791 then. What angle would this line right here be to 190 degrees? And just measure that angle that is swept out right in through there, okay? So that'll give you a feel for what kind of storms are going to develop. And you can answer that one. Make sure to practice this, because on the next video, on the next quiz, quiz 10, which may end up being our final quiz, I won't go through and explain how to do everything. Again, I'll just kind of turn you loose, but you will have already learned how to do it though through this video. Okay? I want to make sure everybody knows what to expect. So again, the 190 degrees is your 1 kilometer storm ground relative wind, which is, we're going to assume that's the boundary orientation. Many times, guys, in many severe weather setups, that will be the orientation of the boundary, will be the orientation of the 1 kilometer wind. Okay, so we'll move on now to question 9. Please use the hodograph examples below to decide whether our quiz 9 hodograph resembles violent EF4 plus hodographs from the past. So you'll just compare this hodograph here, the hodograph trace in red, that's what that's called, to the general shape here. And you'll compare and contrast, and I'm sure after looking at it for a while, you'll probably have to study it for a spell, but you'll be able to get this question. And note this specific where certain kinks occur, like your transition from predominantly speed shear, which is this straight leg, to predominantly directional shear, which is this. See that kink right there that happens at 1 kilometer approximately? That was something that was noted by Thompson and Edwards from the Storm Prediction Center, Roger Edwards and Rich Thompson from the Storm Prediction Center back around 2000. They noticed this hodograph kink right here. And oftentimes that hodograph kink is a sign of something very bad. I'll just throw that out here now. So if you take a look at that and compare them to some of that's not the only thing I'm going to ask you to look for to help you answer this question, but that's one thing you might want to consider. They kind of all have kinks to a degree, but another thing to look for is the orientation of the upper level winds. You see how the upper level winds here are more westerly? See, they're almost due east of your lower level flow. See that? Also keep that in mind. Those are oftentimes your big tornado days too. Not always, but many times those are associated with some bigger events. Okay, so let's go down here. After you review that one, you'll head to question 10. Based on everything discussed in the Quiz 9 video and within the other lesson material of our ninth compartment here, ninth chapter of the course, what do you ascertain the tornado threat to be within our Quiz 9 scenario? This scenario. Okay? And just go down the list, and I give you a little bit more helpful information here. You might want to go back and look at your energy helicity index. It's right here. You might want to consider what you get there. However, do keep in mind that the energy helicity index is kind of like the sweat. There's other things that can make up or detract from the tornado threat aside from the numerical value itself. Okay? So, something else I should mention is this critical angle. Esterheld and Giuliano, 2008, their paper. Once you determine the critical angle found by the storm relative inflow vector at the surface and the 0 through 5 kilometer bulk shear, 0 through 500 meters, bulk shear, the angle swept out, you're going to want to kind of understand that anything less than about 45 degrees is viewed very unfavorably for significant tornadoes. Here in the Deep South especially, we can have critical angles 50, sometimes in the upper 40s to 45. A lot of times, though, our big critical angles, big tornado days feature critical angles around 60, 70, maybe as high as 80, but normally they're around 60, 65 to 70 for our big-time tornado days here in the Big South. And that can help you lean a little bit more weight into your final assessment of how high the tornado threat is. Okay? Also keep in mind your orientation of your bulk shear vector to your storm initiating boundary. Have to find the problem. Here it is. My question 3. Generally speaking, anything of 60 degrees or more will be found with major tornado days. That's not always the case. Like I mentioned, if you have a bulk shear vector to the storm initiating boundary of less than 45 degrees or less, but a very high storm relative helicity, a lot of times that can spin up some powerful tornadoes that way too. But this is the more conventional or classic 60 degrees or greater. Okay? So I sure hope that helps you. Another thing that you want to look for is do your storm relative wind vectors veer with height? Remember, this is the surface and you're climbing in the hodograph. There's 2,000 meters, 4,500 meters, 900 meters. So as you go up the hodograph, you're climbing in altitude. One of the things we look for in severe weather forecasting also, this is just a little aside, is you want your storm relative wind vectors to veer with altitude. If they're all stacked on top of each other at one place and then they continue to move again a little bit, many times that's not a big tornado day. Or possibly it could be if you have huge cape. You'd have to have buoyancy of 3,000 or higher typically. But many times whenever the storm relative wind vectors veer with height, turn clockwise or veer with height, that's a big tornado day. And I'll let you ascertain, kind of figure out for yourselves what's going on here. But as you climb with height, do these stack on top of each other, or are they veering very nicely or fluidly with height? Okay, that's another clue. All right. So guys, I sure hope that helps. I think we've been going a little over 30 minutes now. I think we're at 34 minutes. So I'll go ahead and stop there. But in closing, know this about the remainder of the course. Know that there's probably only going to be 10 quizzes. Okay, I don't want to overload you. The next quiz will more than likely be dealing with some more tornado forecasting scenarios given off of everything we've learned. And then your third quarter homework exam, I believe I'm going to release that. I'm looking at my calendar. I'll try to have that out to you guys by, let's just go ahead and say a week from today. Okay, I will have your third quarter homework exam or your third quarter exam ready. And then after that, we're going to be, we'll probably do one more quiz. And then from here on out, it'll just be review for the final. I might even be able to release the final a little early, maybe the 2nd or 3rd of December, possibly earlier. So if you guys have any thoughts on that, you can let me know. Shoot me an email, please. My door is always open. Electronic door, anyway, is always open for you guys. Let me know what you think, what you'd like to see. If this information is helpful, if it's not, just be real with me. Be open. I'm very cool with that. It's no problem. It's not going to adversely affect your grade in any form or fashion because I'm a fair teacher. Have none of that in the foggiest part of my mind. So again, for the hodograph, we'll go over it one more time. This is the hodograph trace in dark red right through here. And from that, the next thing you want to do is know where your storm motion vector is, storm motion dot. Many times it's a dot or a triangle or a square. Ours is just a big black blob dot right there. Did this in pencil. So that's the next thing you'll need. Then to form your storm relative wind vectors, you just trace from your storm motion dot back to the hodograph at that whatever level you want to find storm relative wind vectors for. 1 kilometer, 500 meters, 3,000 meters, etc. 5791, many folks plot them at 6 kilometers, but I didn't quite have a 6 kilometer reading from the Raywin sonde, the radiosonde balloon, so I just put it at 5791, etc. The bulk shear vectors trace from the surface to the respective level you want to find bulk shear for. So this is the surface to 5791 meter storm relative bulk shear vector. Excuse me, it's been a long day. Bulk shear vector, surface to 5791 bulk shear vector. This dashed bold black line right here. Surface to 9,000 meter, 9 kilometer bulk shear vector right here. Storm motion vector, which tips or ends, truncates, stops at the terminates at the black dot. Okay. The heights are either in kilometers or meters. That's pretty easy to discern what's what. Your critical angle, the angle between your storm relative inflow vector, which is the surface storm relative wind vector, just another term for it, another way to put it, and your 0 through 500 meter bulk shear, surface through 500 meter bulk shear vector. Okay, that's critical angle right there. All right. If you have any other questions, be sure to holler. Take care. Thanks.